Beautiful. Here we are. Taking another deep breath in. We breathe in peace. We exhale love. Excellent. So today I have a few things planned for us. And we're going to start by reading along with the pamphlet. And then I'm going to be going into a story that I've actually read from here before, but it's important to reread again because it's going to make an important part or make an important point. And then I'm going to go into some controversial shit. So bear with me. Normally, I don't do too much controversial stuff just because it triggers people's egos, and I do that in sessions all the time. But on Sundays, it's kind of hard to trigger people's egos because I can't always, you might leave still triggered versus being able to talk it through and come back to peace. But I'm hoping today I'm able to do it in an effective way to where it may not fully trigger. You might feel something come up, but you'll understand the tone of my voice, that it's not so much to push you over the edge. And I'm probably making a bigger deal out of it than it's going to be. But it's certain things that I don't always talk about just because they're current events. And we often have people here that are from multiple religious backgrounds and multiple political spectrums. And so it can get complicated. But at the end of the day, you can't always ignore these huge issues going on because they're actively impacting our life right now. So we'll see how we do. And you can let me know if you like me pushing the buttons a little bit. So let's take a breath. So this week's reflection, you're welcome to follow along. It's all about judgment, rooting out judgment. So judgment derives from the three aspects of our ego: push, pull, and hold tight. We push away or resist what we dislike, we chase after and grasp for what we like, and we hold tight to things, people, and beliefs that make us feel insecure when their stability is in jeopardy. So this is a big teaching in my book, The Three Aspects of Ego, because for those of you this might be new, ego is often talked about a lot, and there's so many definitions to it. So I decided when I rewrote Living Peace to designate a full chapter just for that, to really help us understand the way in which we resist things, the way in which we chase after things, and the way in which we hold tight to things. And for those of you, maybe you've heard me say this 10, 20 times, but still, unless we're thinking about it on a daily basis, chances are we fall into ego. Who fell into ego this week? Right? Where we get into that tizzy within ourselves, the emotional state where we're resisting, we're chasing after things, and we're in the fear of holding things tight. A lot of judgment. Well, we'll go ahead and break it down. So push turns into the dislikes, and it's all the things that really frustrate us. And the things that frustrate us, make us impatient, trigger our ego. Really, they are the things that turn into the harsh judgments. Anytime we're having harsh judgments within our mind, and we can even justify these judgments as being warranted and they're coming from a good place and yada, yada, yada. But at the end of the day, if we're actually in harsh judgment, we're quite out of alignment and we're not in solution mode at all. We're just validating our ego. Because a lot of times when we're judging someone else, it actually gives the ego a pat on the back because it's kind of like, well, they're a shit show, but I'm doing okay. So it turns into this comparison game that is so not helpful. Then we have the pull, which equals the likes, and this is the grasping. And who's ever chased after or grasped for something that really made you excited, or you thought that it was just going to lead to this really happy thing, but then it turned into a disappointment, right? And so it's fascinating that even the things that we really enjoy and the things that we like, often because of the nature of impermanence, there's always a disappointment that's going to follow it. There's always going to be some hurt that follows it. Even the things that are beautiful, even the things that you love. Just look at the nature of a flower. You pluck it, you put it into the vase, and then it's beautiful for a while, but then it dies. If you really take a look at that, that's the nature of all life, really. But what's interesting is that we don't realize is that the moment that it's in the vase, and even though it looks nice for a week, during that whole period, it's dead or it's dying. And so we don't often see that it's already the compost that it will soon be. And so it's really interesting, the nature of how we're chasing after things and we're judging them as what is going to bring us happiness, satisfaction, etc. But in actuality, it's always just a fleeting thing. And then the holding. This is a big issue, especially right now here in America. And holding is always about the stability and the control, and it's often involves insecurity of the unknown and then fear. And so we can see this happening in a global spectrum, but we can also see this happening in our very daily lives. Who's ever been in a not great relationship before, either a friendship or maybe a family dynamic, or it could even just be, again, romantic, where it was kind of abusive, right? I'm sure we've all experienced that to some extent. Who held on a little longer than you needed to, right? And so it's important to point this out and remind ourselves of it, because we hold on because we have this idea, maybe we're in love with the potential of it, or maybe that we're afraid of the unknown of what happens if we fully let this go. How will I feel? What if I made the wrong decision? And then that weird gap period where I have no one in my life. You know, even addictions, heavy addictions that hurt us actually act as friends, and they keep us company at night rather than leaving us alone with our thoughts. And so it's fascinating where on a very micro level, it impacts all of our lives to where we hold on to things even if they're not that healthy for us, and it causes further pain. And then on a global spectrum, we see a lot of this mentality of holding on to certain things of the past, even though things are always constantly changing and moving forward. And so even living here, you know, every now and then I'll hear people be like, I love how Bayfield's changing. And then I hear how other people are like, I hate how Bayfield's changing. And so it's interesting that you can always find this dynamic of holding on to things. And when you hold on too long, it then turns into push at times to where you're in a very deep state of resistance. And so in Dunisha and Living Peace, we love to break judgment down into discernment. So rather than coming from a judging mind, we come from a discerning mind. And I have it written down here in that discernment is neutral and informative, while judgment is riddled with emotions and mental bias. So if you're all worked up about something, you know you're adding a bias to it. Just put that down. Just always adopt that in your mind. If you're really worked up about something, and even maybe it's a beneficial thing that's motivating you to do some beneficial change, still take a step back and say, wow, I really am in judgment right here because I'm so emotional about it, and maybe I'm a bit neurotic about it. So there definitely is something there where my egos can easily take over and actually lead me into further judgment and further separation, versus saying, wow, I'm really triggered here. Let me drop into my meditative practice for a moment and drop into discernment. Let me neutralize this and focus on the facts and focus on the information at hand, versus getting so emotional about it, triggering, impulsive, and biased about it. Again, this is something that many of us may experience even just on a daily basis. Maybe in your job, it's very stressful, and then there's people that trigger you. And that's another example. We have to take a step back so we can fully serve them. Because if we're in our own bias and we're in our own judgment, it becomes a lot harder to hold space for other people who might be going through pain. Because if people are acting shitty towards you, chances are they're in a shitty place. That sounds awful. That sounds judgmental. If people are acting shitty towards you, chances are they're in a very turbulent, painful place, because a lot of times the people who cause the most pain are in the most pain themselves. And so that's always an important reminder. A couple quotes I have, or quotes, sayings that I have down here that I love to use, and this is what really helped me get to a neutral space, no matter who I'm interacting with or what I'm observing in the world, is I don't need to have an opinion about this. So start saying that if you want. I don't need to have an opinion about this. Even especially on little things that happen throughout the day, where you interact with someone, you'll never see them again, and you notice that you're judging them. Do you really need to freaking have an opinion about them in that moment? Absolutely not. But again, you're forming some story about their life without actually asking them about their life. And yes, we can look at the global events, what's happening, and we say, but I need to have an opinion about this so I can effectively create change. But then Alaric comes along and says, actually, you can still create great change without getting so emotionally and biased involved with an opinion. Because what happens when you have really hard opinions is often, especially if they're one-sided, you stop hearing the other side. And that actually leads to further separation. Versus if you maintain a neutral state and you say, okay, this is violence, this is harm, let's do something about this. Stating something as violent and harmful is not necessarily an opinion, it's a fact. But when you're saying this is awful, this is horrible, you see how you're adding duality to it? You're actually adding an opinion on top of the fact already. And so I think I shared this in a session this week where if we're parenting a child in Dunisha, rather than saying, don't go out into the street, it's bad, we would, rather than saying it that way, which is an opinion, we state it factually by saying, don't go out into the street. You're going to get hit by a car. You could get hit by a car and it will lead to pain. You see how it changes the dialogue there, where we just say good, bad, right, wrong because it's easy. You know, don't do that, that's bad. Again, that's an opinion, but when we say don't do that, it's actually going to lead to great harm. You see the difference in dynamic there? We changed it from just an opinion into a fact. And people are much more receptive to facts than your glorified opinions. Does that make sense? So it helps you bridge communication so much more effectively. So again, that's the first one there. The second one is people can only, this is for people who fear judgment and don't like judgment and have all that fun stuff that goes along with that. People can only perceive me to the extent of their vibration and layer of consciousness. That's a mouthful. People can only perceive me to the extent of their vibration and layer of consciousness. So if someone is in a peaceful space, do you think they're going to be, even if you're a hot mess, they're probably going to be able to hold space for you and not really judge you. But even if you're like at the height of your life and you're in perfection, there's no such thing, but you feel great about yourself and things are going well, and you go and you share these wonderful things with this person who's in immense pain, they're going to judge you. And so that's the irony, is that who you are and what you're doing in your life has nothing, and how people are judging you has nothing to actually do with you, but it has to do with the person's own state of vibration and state of consciousness and where they're at in their life. If they are in pain, they are going to see through that filter. If they are in peace, they're going to see through that filter. And so when we're always worried about judgment from other people, you're off the hook. Yes, if you're doing things that are causing harm, sure, you're going to have a harder time. But even if you're doing that and then you come speak to me, because of the work that I do, I'm still going to see you in a light that is non-judgmental. 15 years ago, if you came to me when I was going through my shit, no. There was a short period where I was in my little self-righteous streak, and then everything was good, bad, right, wrong. I boxed everything up in nice little packages, and then if it challenged my reality, I would shut that shit down and I'd separate myself, which is what a lot of us do anytime that we feel threatened or anytime that we feel uncomfortable in a situation. And so really just take those two nuggets away today with, do I need to have an opinion about this? Most often, no. And then if I struggle with judgment, really it has more to do with the people perceiving me and their layer of consciousness and their vibration and their ego versus who I actually am. Does that make sense? So pretty interesting stuff. That's just laying the groundwork for today's conversation, understanding the nature of judgment and the push, the pull, the hold tight, all that fun stuff. Let's take a breath. Oh, hot damn. Let's keep going. Okay. So maybe a month or two ago, I read this. And so it's called The Last Sack of Rice. And it's a story from Thich Nhat Hanh from his book, At Home in the World. And for those of you who don't know Thich Nhat Hanh, he was a Zen monk who grew up in Vietnam. And he was probably in his 20s or something when the Vietnam War happened. And he experienced the Indochina War, he experienced the Vietnam War, then he was exiled by his country because he was advocating peace and he wasn't taking sides. And then, long story short, he for decades, he's done this peace work, and he now has Plum Village in France, which is probably one of the world's greatest monasteries and teachers of mindfulness. So it's really, really, really beautiful. And he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Martin Luther King Jr., and they were good friends before, of course, he passed. So The Last Sack of Rice. In 1946, during the French Indochina War, I was a novice monk at a temple in central Vietnam. At that time, the city was occupied by the French army, which is interesting because, again, years later, he ended up in France, and they were the country that brought him in, even though the first war he experienced was actually from the French. Really fascinating stuff. One day, 2 French soldiers arrived at our temple. While one stayed in the jeep outside the temple gate, the other came in carrying a gun and demanded all of our rice. We had only 1 sack of rice for all the monks, and he wanted to take it away. The soldier was young, not yet 20, and hungry. He looked thin and pale as if he had malaria, which I also had at the time. I had to obey this order to carry our heavy bag of rice to the jeep. It was a long distance, and I staggered under the bag's precious weight. Anger and unhappiness rose up in me. They were taking what little rice we had, leaving our community without food. As I walked back to the temple, I was crying. Only later did I learn that one of the elder monks had secretly buried a large container of rice on the temple grounds deep in the earth. Many times over the years, I have meditated on this French soldier. I have seen that still in his teens, he had to leave his parents, brothers, sisters, and friends to travel across the world to Vietnam, where he was faced with the horrors of killing my countrymen or being killed himself. I have often wondered whether the soldier survived the war and was able to return home to his parents. It is likely that he did not survive. The French Indochina War lasted many years, ending only in the French defeat and the Geneva Accords in 1954. After looking deeply, I came to realize that the Vietnamese were not the only victims of the war, the French soldiers were victims as well. With this insight, I no longer had any anger towards the young soldier. Instead, compassion for him rose within me, and I only wished him well. I did not know the French soldier's name, and he did not know mine, but when we met, we were already enemies. He came and was prepared to kill me for our food, and I had to comply in order to protect myself and my fellow monks. And yet the two of us were not by nature enemies. Under different circumstances, we could have become close friends, even maybe love each other as brothers. It was the war that separated us and brought violence between us. This is the nature of war. It turns us into enemies. People who have never met kill each other out of fear. War creates so much suffering. Children become orphans, entire cities and villages are destroyed. All who suffer in such conflicts are victims. Coming from a background of such enormous devastation and suffering as I have experienced from the Indochina War and the Vietnam Wars, I have a deep aspiration to prevent war from ever happening again. It is my prayer that nations will no longer send their young people to fight each other, not even in the name of peace. I do not accept the concept of war for peace, nor such a thing as a just war, in the same way that I cannot accept the concepts of just slavery, just hatred, or just racism. During the wars in Vietnam, my friends and I declared ourselves neutral. We took no sides and we had no enemies, North or South, French, American, or Vietnamese. I absolutely love that ending portion there where they were neutral and they took no sides. And truthfully, that's what the Zen cowboy is, and that's what Dunisha is. Although we have our preferences, you know, if I took major sides, I would not be able to hold space for people in sessions or hold space in just everyday life. And that's why today, the things I'm going to be saying is more about extensions of the teachings, even though you might see that they side more one-sided with a certain political group or one-sided more with a certain religious idea. Don't even think that way at all, because this is just human nature and understanding the nature of suffering, if that makes sense. And so if you get triggered at all, again, we'll see how much I go into. Maybe I'll make a separate video for this. I invite you to just take a breath and take a step back. Listen to the bell and go from there. So let's take a breath. So that story I can read about, and you don't really get triggered by that necessarily. You might have compassion and whatnot, but you may not fully get triggered by that. But what's interesting is that if I shared that story during the Vietnam War, you probably would have gotten triggered. And that's what's fascinating about, because that's very political, that's very politically charged, what was going on there. But what's interesting is that the topics that I'm sharing, I might go into today, 50 years from now, I can easily talk about them and no one will get triggered. But talking about them today, because they're current events and what's currently going on in our society, they're very triggering. And so that's just a very fascinating thing that occurs. And that I just love that, where it's like, very politically charged 40, 50 years ago. Currently, not so much. But today's events, if I talk about them 50 years from now, it'd be much easier than talking about them today. So let's take a breath. So a soft one I'd like to kind of talk about, not really soft, but there was I don't know what it is today. I'm guessing it's not that much different, but in 2012, the federal prisons, did you know that 50% of the men in them were in there for drug crimes, and 58% of women in them were for drug crimes? And so that's just an interesting statistic to share, and that half of our prison system, the people in there are for drug-related crimes. And they're not necessarily violent people, but because of our system and how we approach drugs, they go right into it. And what's fascinating about that, what I love, is that I've worked majorly with addiction over these past 10 years, some of which individuals who've been in prison because of that. And so what I love about this topic is that who's ever had the belief or judged someone that was on drugs and you just thought they deserved what they got because they were making poor decisions with their life? Generally, people have that mentality. When you really don't know someone and you see them doing things that are harmful to themselves and to other people, or they might be in addiction, maybe they're stealing, or they might be doing other things. Maybe from the addiction, domestic violence occurs. And so instantly, without knowing these individuals, we have a judgment and we say, well, serves them right. But that's not very helpful, is it? And so that keeps this idea of ignorance alive. And ignorance stems from a not knowing. But over the years, working with individuals who have been in prison and people who've gone through major addictions, and there's a lot of people who have major drug addictions who are not in prison, who just never got caught. And they actually live functioning lives. It's really fascinating. And so the real thing that we want to say here, rather than getting caught up into duality of this is bad and this is wrong and people are making shitty decisions and they deserve what they get, we change the dialogue and we say, there's a lot of suffering here. There is a lot of suffering here. And what can I do to better understand this suffering? How can I be of greater service and assistance? And here's a fun fact for you, maybe not necessarily a fact, but at least from my experience, a lot of people who get into heavy drugs, a lot of it stems from the environment that they grew up in. And so if you look at their childhood and you look at what was going on there, it's really interesting to see why X, Y, Z happens. And so how many people, maybe in your own life, you may have never known a single moment of peace your entire life. All you've known has been stress, conflict, survival, etc. And that's very fascinating when you actually look at the source of where these things come from. And all of a sudden, when you look at an adult as a child and you see the suffering that they experienced, what led into the decisions that they're making, it's interesting. It softens the heart and it leads to compassion. And then again, rather than saying this is wrong, this is bad, let me push this away, we simply say, how can I understand this better? How can I lean into this more? How can I be of further assistance? Versus just shutting it down and putting all the things that are uncomfortable away or locking them up. Does that make sense? And so that's just an issue that is really going on right now. And by the way, another statistic, so we have over 2 million people incarcerated here in America. And we're the #1, maybe you've heard this before, but we're actually the country with the most people locked up in the world. We even beat China. And so it's really fascinating that we have the most people in prison in the entire world. And now as they become more privatized, they get more money from the more people that they have in prison. And that's another issue that's going on too. If you want a really good look into this, I talked about this a few weeks ago, watch Orange is the New Black. I know it's glamorized for TV and all that stuff, but there really is, especially the last couple seasons, it's gonna stab you in places that really, really make you uncomfortable and shed light on important topics that are just not being talked about. So pretty cool stuff, not cool stuff, but you know what I mean. So let's talk about bias and judgment further. So let's imagine like we have our town block parties and then a Muslim family moves into town and the woman wears a hijab. Or maybe even just the headscarf, maybe just part of it. She just wears the headscarf, but then you see that, there's various Islamic men, very Islamic looking around them. I would not doubt, even if you're very open-hearted and open-minded, that there might be a part of you that goes, because unfortunately, for the past 20, 30 years, we've been very much trained to have judgment and bias against that. And even though we may not inherently be racist, we see it, and because of the propaganda that we have been fed for so long, and some of it's true, some of it is true, but instantly our mind goes towards here. It's like, what are they doing here? What's going on? They feel changing again. First, I've got the gays and the Buddhists. Oh, can't handle this all in 1 year, right? But then they open up a restaurant, which we need restaurants here. We all know this. We want more restaurants. And maybe we've never had Arabic food before, but we go ahead and try it because we're tired of what we've always had. So we go and try it, we love it. And we interact with them. All of a sudden, the fear evaporates and we're grateful. But then they want to open a mosque. And then a few more families move in. And it puts into question our own town's identity. You know, not that long ago, it was a KKK hub. Some people know this, some people didn't know this. And here's my mental bias that happened. The first month, the first 2 weeks we were here, there was a man in a white robe outside leaving the restaurant. And where did my mind go? KKK member. And I felt really, really unsafe. The first time I've ever felt really unsafe for being gay in my life. But again, I don't know what that was. But because of the town's history, my mind instantly goes towards fear. And again, this isn't right or wrong, good or bad that our mind does this. I'm just teaching you that your mind makes assumptions and it jumps to biases without even knowing any facts. It sees one thing that makes it uncomfortable, then bam, you created a story. And then you might gossip about it, which I did. I told my family, and then I went over, and then, you know, and then I actually told one of my friends, and then I made them feel about like not that safe coming here, that it's not a great town. But now, obviously, a year later, we absolutely love it, and it's a very welcoming town for us. Granted, we've had some hiccups, but do you see how we create these assumptions, but then they get dissolved, but then something else triggers it? And I'm just using this example because maybe not you necessarily would have this issue, but the town's identity certainly would, just based off of how many people we've met and we've known. Even us being here, you know, we didn't have curtains for a while, so there was always a Buddha looking out the window. That triggered some people. And so it's really, really fascinating. Here's another issue with bias that has fatally harmed people over the years. So on 2020 with Barbara Walters, 2014, they were talking about medical bias in medicine. And she was talking to this doctor who was sharing that pretty much up till recently, science has always, or medical professionals have always just deemed women as men with pesky hormones. And so almost all their studies that they would do would be done on men rather than women, because they didn't want the menstrual cycle or the hormones to get involved, because it could throw the studies off. And they would even do this regarding studies involving cancer of the breasts and uterus, even when men don't have that issue. But because they viewed them just pretty much the same thing, just with varying hormones, they thought, let's just do it this one way. And obviously that has led to great harm over the years, and only now is medicine starting to fully catch up to speed, but it still has a long ways to go. How scary is that, just with that belief that they're pretty much just the same thing, but just more emotions and hormones? But what's fascinating, even if that was the damn case, you'd want to study that, because if hormones can throw it off, study it more. Right? If the menstrual cycle does throw off medication, study that. That will help it. But again, because of the chauvinistic mindset that we have, it might, I don't know if it goes back to this or not, but it would make sense. You know, obviously there's 2 creation stories in the Bible, but it certainly doesn't freaking help when it's just like, Eve was created from a rib of the man. That is not a helpful belief to have. But it's interesting how we have these belief systems that then impact very drastic things on our planet. So isn't that crazy? Isn't that crazy? Isn't that crazy? And that was 2014 when the man admitted that to Barbara Walters. 2014. So breathe that in. And I can go deeper into it, but it's just interesting how when we have certain ideas about things, how it alters our decisions. So really think about that. My judgments impact my decisions. My judgments impact my decisions. And when you have a society that are all agreeing around the same thing, it's going to impact your decisions. It's going to impact the ways that you vote. It's going to impact the ways that you treat groups of people. I know this firsthand in my own life. We know this firsthand as a gay married couple. Nothing hurt me more when I was growing up, when before gay marriage was legal, when I had really close friends to me that knew me, and I asked them, I'm like, do you agree with gay marriage? And they said no. And I'm like, but you know me. But they're like, it's wrong. But I like you as a person, but I don't think you should be able to get married. And so in my mind, still as a young adult, and I was probably a teen still at the time, I was having such a hard time wrapping my mind around that, because that's a decision that doesn't impact them, but it changed my life. This changed my life. Drastically influenced me. And this person never even asked my opinion. But instead, and many of the people were often, my friends were often religious that had those viewpoints. But what's fascinating is that, and here's a huge issue going on in our culture right now, we're listening, and you're doing it now, you're listening to white men about problems. I'm a white man, so it's ironic I'm saying this, but we often, especially about women's rights, more often you're hearing men talk about it. When you're hearing about colored rights and minority rights, again, you're often listening to white men about it. And it's a lot of times white men that are making these decisions. Just as now we're going back into understanding how men were doing all those studies on men, even for cancer in the uterus and cancer in the breast in women. So again, rather than going to the source and saying, how is this impacting you? Rather than even going to my friends that are just kind of getting into understanding the world, and rather than going to a gay person and saying, tell me about what it's like. Rather than going to a black person, tell me what it's like. Rather than what our own opinions are, and we say, well, I don't see racism anywhere. Do you live in an environment where it really is happening, or are you in an environment where you don't really see it much? And do you even know someone that you can talk to directly? So again, I'm just sharing this because it is so important to understand how we fuck ourselves over on a daily basis with our own mental bias. And it's not anyone's fault. It just happens naturally. You know the ways in which you judge each other in your relationships and your family dynamics. But then we do it in these huge, collective, conscious ways on our planet that really harm people. So for me personally, this is really the hot button topic. So immigration. I'm just going to share my mindset from a Zen mindset. Rather than instantly saying, no, and this isn't happening. If you're crossing that border, you fucking know what you're doing. And so you deserve whatever happens to you because you're breaking the law. My mind, yes, I can understand, but instead my mind goes directly to, I want to know their story. I want to fully understand them knowing what could happen to them, the hardship that is ahead of them to make that crossing, and then to always be here in America in fear of what would happen. And if they gave birth here, what would happen if they got removed from their child? I want to know the story that led them into that. And then my mind goes towards, if they're doing that, then what if the roles were reversed? And if I was a parent and I thought that that was the best situation for my child, instantly I soften and I have a new viewpoint. Maybe I don't have the answer just yet, but it softens me from instantly going, no. And that's the part that I'm just encouraging everyone to play with. Maybe this won't change your mindset. That's not my goal. My goal here today is just to have you ask more questions and stop viewing life through your own lens and only your own lens. Go to the source and ask people about their suffering. Just as when you're in a marriage, ask your partner their suffering and then hold space for it no matter how much it hurts you, because you're probably part of their suffering, right? And just as Thich Nhat Hanh, when it was during the Vietnam War, he came to America and went and talked to churches and gave talks. And there was a man who stood up and said, if you love your country so much, why aren't you over there helping them right now? And he said, he had to deep breathe a lot because he was really triggered by that, because that's his core wound. His people are dying. He said, I have to water the roots of suffering. I have to tend to the roots. And the roots of this war is here in America. And so that's why I'm here teaching and trying to help alleviate this ignorance, this fear-based mindset that is happening against the Vietnamese people. And that's why he came here to talk. And that's the thing I really want to share with you today, is that a lot of these decisions that we're making that may not fully really super impact our lives. In some ways they do. I mean, obviously gay marriage has impacted your lives because we're here. Hello. Because chances are, had we not gotten married, if it wasn't legal, we may not have come here. It might have still felt unsafe to. Gay marriage did impact your lives because it made gay people feel more safe. Interesting, isn't it? So yes, these things impact our lives. But I'm going to share one more thing that might really trigger you. We're just going to keep throwing them at you. I gave up meat because I made a conscious choice that I don't need to feel a pleasurable experience eating something that I enjoy at the sake of killing something else. Really hear that. I gave up a pleasure because meat was good. Fuck, I love sushi especially. Oh, I gave up a pleasure because I made the choice to no longer harm other beings. Now, I'm not perfect. I'm not vegan yet. One day I will be, because I recognize that even the dairy industry, if you actually listen and go into it, and rather than have the blinders on, you'll really see how it's harming a lot of things. And even the ecosystem, the Amazon, did you know that it's the leading distributor of beef in the world? 20% of the world's beef comes from the Amazon. And they're believing that a lot of the fires that have been created, we don't know exactly this one just yet, but a lot of the fires are from loggers and ranchers creating more room to grow more crops and to raise livestock. And so even that leads into it. But really hear that word. I gave up a pleasure so that I did not cause further harm to things that I don't necessarily need to cause harm for. So if I have control over this one aspect of my life to cause less harm, I'm okay giving up a pleasure. And so think about that in our way, where when you give into equality, and please don't fucking take this into like a communist thing. It's not at all. Anytime we talk about this, people instantly go in that direction. We're just like, you're just going all over. No, I'm just talking about meat right here. But when we talk about equality and inequality, when you give equality to those who were previously unequal, it makes you start to feel less equal because you were always used to being up here. And when you give up some of that to make it a playing neutral field, you're actually losing a few things. And I think that's why a lot of people so hold tight to what things used to be. Just like here in Bayfield, things are changing. And they're going to naturally change. That is the nature of life. So having gay Buddhists move into town, there is something that's being given up. You're being given up this reality to where you only had to think of things in a certain way, but now there's new information coming to you that is a bit uncomfortable. And maybe you're always taught that gay people are an abomination, they're out to get your children and yada, yada, yada. There are churches here that teach that, by the way. So that's still happening. Of course, you're going to be giving up something. You're giving up an aspect of your identity that you had always held on to, and it makes you feel insecure. It makes the person feel a bit insecure. May not be as drastic as giving up meat and you have to change your whole damn lifestyle, which I had to. Moving to Bayfield where everything is meat, it was difficult. But again, just think of that, where it's okay to give up things to actually promote well-being for yourself and other people. Stop viewing that as a negative thing. Just think in how you're healing yourself. Who's ever been on a healing journey and had to give up shit, right? Even Steve Jobs, he talks about what led to the success of his company. He decided to focus just on a few things. He said the things that he limited his mindset on and his awareness on, and the things that he was able to give up allowed him to focus fully on what he was actually creating. Now, ironically, you could say, well, Alaric, but now you're just saying limiting. So I can have a limited view and it's going to help things. No, What I'm saying is keeping your life and your heart more open, but being okay with giving up various comforts that you may previously have had that made you feel very safe and secure in a certain way, which was just your own bias of reality. It kept you safe and secure in your own bubble, if that makes sense. So, call to action this week. If you have a mental bias about someone or something, lean into it and actually go ask the fucking source. Go ask someone directly that it impacts their life directly. So if you have a very strong opinion or viewpoint about something, ask the source. And maybe you're like, Alaric, I can't think of anything. Well, then at least apply it in your home and ask the source of your loved ones about their own pain and their own suffering, because every single one of us in this room still suffers to some degree. Open up a dialogue. You could do it on a micro level or a macro level, small scale, large scale, but start thinking. Start thinking. Start thinking. Thank you. Deep breath. Whew. How'd we all do? Well, thank you for those of you on YouTube joining us in. I hope you enjoyed today's sermon, and whether you agree or disagree, that's okay. My job here is just to offer different viewpoints, different perceptions, and to offer a more Zen approach that can assist. Links are below for any donations you'd like to offer or any services you'd like to receive. I'm always willing to work one-on-one, even at a long distance.